Hello. Tonight we drift back nearly 3,000 years to a bend in a quiet river, where mist curls over reeds and shepherd dogs bark somewhere in the distance. This is where the story of Rome begins, not with marble or armies, but with mud, myths, and men who could never have imagined the empire to come. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you're joining from somewhere far away, share your location and the time where you are. It's always amazing to see where in the world our little storytelling circle reaches. Now, dim the lights, let a gentle breeze whisper, and we'll ease into tonight's journey. Long before emperors and legions, there were huts made of straw and clay. Around 753 BCE, so tradition claims, a small community of Latin-speaking tribes settled on 7 low hills near the Tiber River. Their lives were simple: tending flocks, trading a little salt, and keeping wary eyes on neighbouring peoples, the Etruscans to the north and the Sabines to the east. No one then would have guessed these scattered huts would one day command continents. Legend, of course, makes the beginning far grander. The tale of Romulus and Remus, twin sons of the war god Mars and a mortal princess, still stands as one of the world's most famous founding myths. Cast into the Tiber as infants, they were supposedly rescued and nursed by a she-wolf beneath a fig tree, a scene carved and painted endlessly through the ages. Whether that wolf was real, or perhaps a kindly shepherd's wife later misunderstood in the telling, historians still argue whether the story hides a memory of tribal unification or is pure invention. In the myth, Romulus kills his brother in a quarrel over where to build their new city, a grim omen for a people whose history would be marked by ambition and bloodshed. But Romulus's name stuck. Roma became the settlement's name, and he its first king. The early Romans revered strength and order, 2 traits that would echo through their centuries of conquest and governance. The kings of Rome, according to tradition, ruled for roughly 2.5 centuries. 7 of them in all, though modern scholars quietly suspect that neat number might be a little too tidy to be true. The first, Romulus, organized the early population into tribes and established the Senate, an advisory council that would one day outgrow its monarchs. The second king, Numa Pompilius, is remembered for taming that early warrior spirit. He built temples, created the priesthoods, and introduced religious festivals to bind the people together. Under Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius, Rome became more aggressive. Villages were conquered, fortifications rose, and bridges spanned the Tiber. One quirky tale says Tullus ignored proper rituals when consulting the gods and was struck by lightning for his arrogance, a warning to later Romans about balancing faith and pride. Ancus, on the other hand, built Rome's first port at Ostia, giving it access to trade and salt routes that would fuel its rise. Then came the Etruscan kings, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and finally Tarquinius Superbus, the Proud. They brought new technology and art from the wealthy Etruscan cities to the north. Arched drains that dried marshland, ceremonial robes, and the mysterious fasces, a bundle of rods around an axe blade, symbolizing authority. The very word Etruscan still carries an air of mystery. Their language survives only in fragments, their origins still debated. Some say they came from Lydia in Asia Minor, others that they were native Italians who rose early to sophistication. One quirky Etruscan contribution might make modern listeners smile. They painted tomb walls with scenes of banquets and dancing, showing that life, even in death, was to be enjoyed with gusto. Perhaps that's why Roman feasts later became so legendary. During the reign of Servius Tullius, Rome expanded its boundaries and built its first real city walls. He's credited with creating the census, a systematic count of citizens by wealth and property. That census determined who could serve in the army and who could vote. In a sense, Servius built the first Roman bureaucracy, though without the paperwork headaches of modern times. But power, as always, tempted corruption. Tarquinius Superbus, the final king, ruled with cruelty. He ignored the Senate, executed rivals, and used forced labour for grand construction projects, most notably the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. When his son assaulted a noblewoman named Lucretia, her tragic suicide sparked a revolution. Her husband and allies, outraged, swore an oath to end monarchy forever. Thus, in 509 BCE, the Romans expelled their king and declared a republic. They vowed never again to bow to a single ruler. The word Rex King became almost taboo. In its place rose the idea of shared power, of res publica, the public thing. Of course, shared was relative. Power rested mostly with the patricians, Rome's noble families, while commoners, or plebeians, had to fight for their rights in the centuries ahead. Still, this transition marked a turning point unmatched in ancient history. From monarchy to a complex system of elected magistrates and checks and balances. It wasn't democracy as we know it, but it was an experiment that would shape Western government forever. Archaeology gives this legend a little backbone. Excavations on the Palatine Hill, the supposed home of Romulus, have revealed post holes and hut remains from around 800–700 BCE, matching the myth's rough timeline. Pottery shards show contact with Greek traders even in those early centuries. The humble village was already plugged into the buzzing network of Mediterranean exchange. One curious tidbit unearthed there: traces of early votive offerings, small figurines and charms thrown into sacred pits. These weren't for decoration, but were spiritual messages, whispers to unseen gods. Some were oddly shaped or crudely made, suggesting ordinary people made them, not artisans. It's a touching reminder that long before senators debated or emperors posed for statues, Rome's people were simply hoping for good harvests, safe births, and protection from storms. By the end of the regal period, Rome had grown from a scattering of huts to a bustling town with temples, markets, and a population of perhaps 20,000. It was still a small player in central Italy, but it had something others lacked: a sense of destiny, of organised purpose, and of unity born from struggle. The very traits that began in those muddy hills would one day move legions across continents. As night deepens in our story, the torches of the monarchy gutter and fade, the kings are gone. In their place, senators murmur plans for a new kind of power, one shared, argued, and fiercely defended. The Republic is stirring awake. The dawn of the Roman Republic was not a quiet one. The streets that once echoed with the commands of kings now murmured with the voices of men learning to govern themselves. After centuries of monarchy, Rome found itself in an experiment both thrilling and uncertain, a society without a crown, ruled instead by the restless ambitions of its citizens. 2 new leaders, called consuls, replaced the king. Elected annually, they shared power so that no one man could grow too mighty. One could veto the other's decisions, a safeguard against tyranny that might sound noble unless, of course, you were the poor soul trying to get anything done. Behind them stood the Senate, filled with patricians, Rome's oldest and richest families. These men advised, influenced, and, truth be told, manipulated nearly every law and war declaration that passed through the city. Early Rome was still small enough that citizens could gather in person to vote in the assemblies. Each man's vote was tied to his wealth and social class. The richest voted first, and often their consensus carried before the poorer citizens' turn even came. Still, the system felt revolutionary for its time. The Romans believed in mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors, a set of unwritten traditions guiding moral and political life. There was no holy book, no divine king, only this idea that what the ancestors did must be worth preserving. But, as you might expect, not everyone felt represented in this tidy new order. The plebeians, who made up most of the population, quickly realized that their voices barely carried in the marble halls of power. They served in the army, paid taxes, and worked the farms, yet decisions about war, trade, and justice came from men born into privilege. So they protested Roman style. Around 494 BCE, during what became known as the First Secession of the Plebs, they simply walked out. They left the city en masse, camping on a nearby hill, refusing to fight or farm until they gained some say in government. Without its workers and soldiers, Rome ground to a halt. The patricians had no choice but to compromise. The result was the creation of the tribune of the plebs, a special office that could veto unfair decisions and defend common citizens. It was a remarkable innovation, a legally protected voice for the powerless. Any harm to a tribune was considered a crime against the gods themselves. Historians still argue whether this early social contract was truly fair or merely a clever way for elites to keep the peace, but it set a precedent that power could, at least in theory, answer to the people. As the Republic stabilized, it turned its gaze outward. Neighboring tribes, once rivals, were brought into Rome's sphere. Some were conquered outright, others were offered alliances with partial citizenship. This mixture of diplomacy and force became Rome's signature move. Instead of destroying defeated peoples, it absorbed them. Soldiers from conquered towns could become Romans, and Romans from humble families could rise through military service. The city's population swelled, its ambitions growing in proportion. Around this time, the Romans began codifying their laws. In 451 BCE, after years of dispute, they created the 12 Tables, a written legal code engraved on bronze and displayed in the forum for all to see. No longer could judges twist the rules to favour their class. Everyone, theoretically, could point to the same set of laws. One quirky line from the tables prohibited burial within city walls, perhaps less a moral statement than an ancient version of good urban hygiene. The Republic's rhythm was one of constant tension between classes, ambitions, and ideals. The patricians wanted to maintain their prestige, the plebeians demanded equality, and while both sides fought bitterly in the political arena, they united against external threats. Rome's legions grew more disciplined, organised into rigid formations, known as maniples. Every citizen soldier trained not for glory, but for duty, virtus, as they called it, meaning courage and excellence in service to the state. One mainstream historical fact stands out. Rome's early wars against its Latin and Etruscan neighbours shaped not only its territory, but its character. In 390 BCE, the Gauls invaded and actually sacked Rome, burning much of the city. For the Romans, it was a trauma that would linger for centuries. They rebuilt stronger walls and hardened their outlook on the world. From that day on, they feared chaos above all and swore it would never happen again. Among the ruins, they supposedly paid the Gauls a ransom in gold. When the Gauls complained that the Roman weights were rigged, the Roman general Brennus tossed his sword onto the scale and declared, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. Whether or not that moment truly happened, it became legend Rome's defiant spirit in a single phrase. The quirky side of early republican life, however, was far from all warfare. Romans were surprisingly superstitious, relying on augurs priests who interpreted the will of the gods by studying the flight patterns of birds. If a crow flew left instead of right, a meeting might be postponed. Imagine trying to pass a law while everyone craned their necks skyward, waiting for pigeons to give divine approval. Domestic life, too, revolved around ritual. Each home had a small shrine to household gods, the lares and penates, protectors of hearth and family. Meals began with a quiet offering of wine, and every birth, marriage, or journey required a ceremony. Rome was, above all, a society of structure. Even their religion was contractual: pray correctly, perform the ritual exactly, and the gods would uphold their end of the bargain. By the 3rd century BCE, the Republic had consolidated control over the Italian peninsula. Roman roads began to spread outward straight, purposeful lines cutting through hills and forests. They were built to last, and, remarkably, some still exist today. A joke among later Romans claimed that all roads led to Rome, though one suspects that travellers trudging under heavy packs weren't laughing. The Republic was evolving into a machine, a disciplined, adaptable state, capable of absorbing new lands and peoples without losing its core identity. It was also learning something dangerous. Success breeds appetite. The Senate, once focused on local disputes, began to eye the glittering cities across the sea. Carthage, Greece, and the rich islands of the Mediterranean glimmered like jewels waiting to be taken. But beneath this expanding confidence, the old class divisions simmered. The plebeians had won rights, but wealth still concentrated at the top. Veterans returned from war to find their farms bought up by aristocrats who built vast estates worked by slaves. The seeds of internal conflict were being quietly sown among the olive trees. As torches flicker across the forum at night, one can almost hear the echoes of senators arguing beneath the stars, some urging restraint, others whispering of destiny. Rome's republic had awakened, and it was restless. Soon, its ambitions would spill beyond Italy's borders, setting the stage for wars that would decide not just its fate, but the fate of the ancient world. The Republic, once a small city of clay and timber, was now a nation in motion. Rome had survived kings, invasions, and internal strife, and with each victory it seemed to gain not only territory, but purpose. By the 3rd century BCE, the city was no longer content to guard its borders, it meant to shape the world beyond them. What made Rome's expansion so remarkable wasn't only its military power, but its political genius. Unlike other ancient powers that conquered and enslaved, Rome developed an uncanny ability to absorb. Each new victory brought fresh peoples into the Roman fold, not just as subjects, but as partners of varying rank. Conquered towns were granted different degrees of citizenship. Some received full rights, others partial privileges. Some were bound by treaty, required to send soldiers, but free to govern themselves. It was, in effect, a flexible empire before the empire existed. The Romans understood something subtle. Power was more secure when people believed they had a stake in it. Soldiers from conquered towns soon fought alongside Romans as brothers in arms. Roads and colonies stitched Italy together like a quilt of loyalty and obligation. Even enemies, once subdued, were offered a chance to join the winning team. It wasn't equality, but it was opportunity, and that distinction kept Rome expanding for centuries. The Roman army itself became the engine of this growth. Gone were the ragtag militias of early days. In their place stood disciplined formations known as legions, each about 4,000 to 5,000 men, divided into smaller units called cohorts and maniples. Training was brutal but effective. Every legionary was taught to march in perfect step, dig defensive trenches, and build camps that could rise and vanish overnight. The historian Polybius, a Greek who later studied them closely, called Roman discipline their chief strength. Their weaponry reflected practicality over flair. The gladius, a short stabbing sword, proved devastating in close combat, while the pilum, a heavy javelin, was cleverly designed to bend upon impact, preventing enemies from throwing it back. The Romans didn't rely on heroics, they relied on teamwork, planning, and the steady grind of endurance. One mainstream historical fact defines this era: the Samnite Wars. These fierce mountain tribes in central Italy fought Rome through 3 brutal conflicts between 343 and 290 BCE. The Samnites were stubborn and resourceful, using guerrilla tactics in their rugged terrain. In one famous ambush, known as the Caudine Forks, an entire Roman army was trapped in a mountain pass and forced to surrender without a fight. The defeated soldiers were humiliated, forced to walk under the yoke, bent low beneath enemy spears as a sign of disgrace. But Rome learned. It always did. Instead of despair, they reorganized their military system, building roads through difficult terrain to move troops more efficiently. When they returned to face the Samnites again, the result was decisive. The lesson was clear. Setbacks were temporary, but Roman adaptation was permanent. One curious tidbit from this period shows how far Roman pragmatism could go. After conquering certain cities, the Romans built duplicate temples of the local gods in Rome itself. They believed that by welcoming the foreign deity, they could spiritually neutralize the enemy's power. It was an odd mixture of piety and psychology, divine diplomacy through architecture. By 272 BCE, after decades of fighting, Rome stood supreme over the entire Italian peninsula. The final obstacle had been the Greek colonies of southern Italy, most notably the city of Tarentum. When Tarentum called on King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a distant cousin of Alexander the Great, for help, Rome faced a new kind of enemy, a professional Hellenistic army complete with war elephants. Pyrrhus won 2 battles, but at tremendous cost. When congratulated on his victories, he is said to have sighed, "Another such victory, and I am undone." His name endures in the phrase Pyrrhic victory, meaning a win so costly it's indistinguishable from defeat. Historians still argue whether Pyrrhus could have truly conquered Rome had he marched on the city immediately. Some believe his hesitation gave the Romans time to regroup. Others think Rome's citizen army, fueled by pride and numbers, would have risen endlessly until he was driven out. Either way, Pyrrhus eventually retreated, and Rome inherited not just southern Italy, but a reputation as unstoppable. With Italy unified, Rome now faced a new question: what next? The answer, as it often does in history, came through opportunity and accident. Across the sea lay Sicily, a rich and strategic island contested by Greek settlers and a powerful trading empire called Carthage. When local disputes drew both powers in, Rome's first overseas war began. But before we cross the Mediterranean, it's worth pausing to see what life inside this growing republic looked like. The city of Rome itself was a noisy, crowded place. Streets were narrow and uneven, lined with shops, taverns, and apartment-style homes called insulae. Wealthy citizens lived in houses with open courtyards and mosaic floors, while the poor often rented rooms above workshops, where fire was a constant danger. Public fountains, fed by early aqueducts, brought water to the people, though not always cleanly. Politics remained at the centre of Roman life. Campaign season filled the forum with chatter and bribery. Candidates wore dazzling white togas, the origin of the word candidate from candidus, meaning bright and promised reforms they rarely kept. For entertainment, citizens attended festivals honouring gods like Jupiter and Mars, featuring races, plays, and occasionally mock battles. One of the Republic's most defining traits was its legal inclusivity. While social hierarchy remained firm, the idea that citizenship could be extended beyond birth was revolutionary. Rome had turned belonging into a political tool. Over time, citizenship would become the empire's greatest export, something more coveted than gold or grain. Among the most debated topics in Roman studies today is just how open this system really was. Historians still argue whether early Roman generosity toward conquered peoples was sincere idealism or shrewd strategy. Was the Republic truly a model of inclusion, or simply an efficient machine for control? The answer, perhaps, is both. Yet, for ordinary Italians, being Roman meant something tangible. It meant security, legal rights, and the chance, no matter how slim, to rise through service. The Republic offered hope, and hope, as any empire builder knows, is stronger than fear. As the sun set on the 3rd century BCE, the Italian landscape shimmered with new roads, fortified towns, and miles of farmland feeding a growing population. The wolf-nursed city by the Tiber had learned to unite rivals, build systems, and turn diversity into strength. But the wider world was watching, and not everyone welcomed this rising power. Across the waters to the south, Carthaginian ships gleamed under the Mediterranean sun. They ruled the sea as Rome ruled the land. Two powers, both ambitious, both disciplined, both certain of their destiny, were about to collide. The age of the Punic Wars was on the horizon, and with it, the transformation of Rome from a regional power into a global one. The Mediterranean Sea, calm, glittering, and blue, was once the stage for one of history's fiercest rivalries. On one shore stood Rome, newly dominant over Italy and hungry for more. On the other, Carthage, a wealthy maritime power whose ships and merchants had ruled the western seas for centuries. Their conflict, born from trade disputes and ambition, would last over 100 years, reshaping the ancient world and turning Rome from a regional force into an empire. Carthage was older, richer, and far more cosmopolitan than its upstart rival. Founded by Phoenician settlers from modern-day Lebanon, it sat on the coast of North Africa, near today's Tunis. Its merchants dealt in silver, spices, and fine cloth, while its navy controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean. At its peak, Carthage was home to perhaps 500,000 people, a glittering metropolis of wealth and innovation. The Romans, in contrast, still saw themselves as a people of farmers and soldiers. But in Sicily, the two powers' paths collided. Sicily was the prize, fertile, central, and strategically placed. In 264 BCE, a local quarrel between Sicilian city-states drew both Rome and Carthage into the fray. What began as a small intervention soon ignited the First Punic War. The word Punic, by the way, comes from poeni, Latin for Phoenicians, a reminder of Carthage's ancient roots. There was just one problem. Rome had no navy. Carthage had hundreds of warships. Rome had none. But the Romans were nothing if not practical. Capturing a Carthaginian vessel that had run aground, they copied it plank for plank, mass-producing entire fleets in record time. To offset their inexperience at sea, they added a device called the corvus, or crow, a hinged boarding ramp with an iron spike at the end. When Roman ships drew close, the corvus slammed down onto enemy decks, locking the ships together. Sea battles instantly became land battles, and in land fighting, the Romans excelled. The First Punic War dragged on for 23 exhausting years. Rome eventually triumphed in 241 BCE, forcing Carthage to surrender Sicily, the first Roman province outside Italy. But victory came at a cost. Tens of thousands of soldiers had died, and the Republic's finances were drained. One senator reportedly complained that Rome had won by learning to drown. Carthage, meanwhile, seethed with resentment. Its economy staggered under the weight of indemnities, and mercenaries mutinied in a violent rebellion. Yet from this turmoil emerged one of history's most brilliant and dangerous figures, Hannibal Barca. Hannibal was the son of Hamilcar Barca, a Carthaginian general who had fought Rome in Sicily. According to legend, as a child, Hannibal's father made him swear eternal hatred of Rome at a temple altar. Whether or not the story is true, Hannibal grew up to make that oath very real. When Carthage expanded into Spain decades later, he led its armies there, building power and loyalty. His bold move against a Roman allied town in Spain sparked the Second Punic War in 218 BCE. What followed became the stuff of legend. Instead of sailing across the sea, Hannibal led his army complete with cavalry and war elephants over the Alps in winter. The crossing was so daring, so improbable, that it still fascinates historians today. He lost half his men to cold, hunger, and ambushes. But what remained was enough to terrify Rome. The sight of elephants descending from the mountains must have seemed like a nightmare to the Roman soldiers waiting in the northern plains. And yet, these enormous beasts were less effective than their legend suggests. Many perished soon after from exhaustion or the cold. Still, Hannibal's campaign that followed was nothing short of genius. At the Battle of Trebia, he lured Roman forces into icy rivers, then ambushed them with concealed troops. At Lake Trasimene, he trapped an entire Roman army between the water and the hills, killing tens of thousands. But his masterpiece came in 216 BCE at Cannae, a battle that remains a textbook example of tactical brilliance. Facing a much larger Roman force, Hannibal arranged his men in a shallow crescent. As the Romans pushed forward, the centre deliberately fell back, wrapping them deeper into a tightening circle. Surrounded on all sides, the Roman army was annihilated, perhaps 50,000 men slain in a single day. It was one of the bloodiest defeats in Roman history. The Republic reeled. Cities in southern Italy defected to Hannibal, and panic gripped Rome itself. The Senate forbade public mourning to keep morale from collapsing. Yet, even then, Rome refused to surrender. It simply adapted. Instead of confronting Hannibal head-on, they avoided pitched battles and waged a war of attrition. They cut his supply lines, attacked his allies, and took the fight to Spain and North Africa. One man, Publius Cornelius Scipio, emerged as Rome's answer to Hannibal. Still in his 20s, Scipio studied the Carthaginians' tactics, learning from his flexibility and daring. By 204 BCE, Scipio invaded Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy. Their final confrontation came near the city of Zama in 202 BCE. There, Scipio outmaneuvered the great general, using his own methods against him. Hannibal's elephants were scattered by trumpets and clever spacing, his lines broken by Roman cavalry. The once invincible Carthaginian was finally defeated. The Second Punic War ended with Carthage humbled. It surrendered its fleet, paid massive reparations, and promised never to wage war without Roman consent. Rome, on the other hand, emerged transformed. It now controlled Spain, Sicily, and most of the western Mediterranean. Its soldiers returned home, hardened, its senate emboldened. The Republic had learned to fight and to win on a global scale. A quirky footnote from these years: during the war, Romans invented an early emergency currency made of bronze when silver ran short. It wasn't exactly inflation-friendly, but it shows how deeply the conflict strained their economy. Some soldiers even received pay in the form of salt, a practice that gave us the word salary, from salarium. Yet, for all their victory, Rome's leaders remained wary. They remembered Hannibal's ghosts. Decades later, one senator, Cato the Elder, would end every speech, no matter the topic, with the same refrain: Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. And eventually it was. In the Third Punic War, 149-146 BCE, Rome, now overwhelmingly dominant, besieged Carthage once more. For 3 years, the city resisted heroically, but in the end, Roman legions broke through its walls. Street by street, they burned it to the ground. The survivors were sold into slavery, and according to later legend, perhaps apocryphal Romans sowed the soil with salt so nothing would ever grow there again. Historians still argue whether this final destruction was strategic necessity or cruel overkill. Some say Rome feared Carthage's revival. Others believe it was vengeance. Plain and simple. What's certain is that the Mediterranean was never the same afterward. Rome stood unchallenged from Spain to Greece, a single power ruling what it now called Mare Nostrum, our sea. But with great power came great temptation. Wealth and slaves poured into Rome by the tens of thousands. Senators built villas and hoarded land, while ordinary citizens struggled to keep up. The republic that had once prided itself on frugality and duty began to shimmer with luxury and corruption. The Punic Wars had made Rome unstoppable but also unrecognizable. And in the quiet, after Carthage's ashes cooled, a new tension stirred within the republic itself. Rome had conquered the world. Now it would have to learn how to rule it. Rome stood unmatched after its triumph over Carthage. Its legions had crushed the greatest rival of the ancient world, and the spoils of victory poured into the city like a golden tide. Grain ships from Sicily, Spain, and North Africa arrived daily, and with them came riches beyond anything the early Romans could have imagined. The once modest city of farmers and soldiers began to glitter not just with marble and bronze, but with pride. The Senate overflowed with men who had tasted empire. Generals returned from campaigns with chests of gold, jewels, and slaves, hundreds of thousands of them. Some of these captives became tutors or artisans, but most worked on sprawling estates, known as latifundia, vast farms owned by the elite. These estates grew with each conquest, swallowing up the small plots once tended by citizen farmers. The humble peasantry, the backbone of early Rome's army, began to disappear. In the bustling markets, Greek merchants haggled beside Egyptian traders, foreign perfumes mixed with the smell of bread and olive oil. Rome was now the beating heart of a Mediterranean world it controlled, but its pulse had changed. The values that once defined the Republic, frugality, discipline, and civic duty, seemed to fade beneath the weight of wealth. Senators draped in fine togas debated endlessly over glory and greed. New money whispered through the marble halls of temples, buying influence and elections. Public service, once seen as a noble calling, became a ladder of ambition. To the common people, it seemed that the noble families had grown distant, their feasts louder, their houses grander, their compassion thinner. Still, the Roman crowd had its distractions. Theatres multiplied, games became grander, and chariot races drew more passion than politics. A satirical poet later joked that all the people wanted was bread and circuses, though the phrase itself wouldn't be coined for centuries. The truth was already visible. a city so wealthy it could feed and entertain its citizens into silence. Yet behind the laughter and the cheers, cracks widened. Veterans returning from wars found their farms neglected or bought out by aristocrats. With no land, they lost the right to vote or serve in the army, a cruel irony for those who had fought for the Republic's glory. Many drifted into the city, crowding its narrow alleys and sleeping beneath porticos. Poverty swelled in the shadow of the temples. Out of this unrest rose the Gracchi brothers Tiberius and Gaius, two patricians who dared to champion the poor. Tiberius proposed redistributing land to veterans and the dispossessed. His reform, though modest, enraged the Senate. They saw not justice, but a threat to their property and power. In a moment that shocked the Republic, Tiberius was clubbed to death by a mob of senators, the first political blood spilled inside the sacred walls of Rome. A decade later, his younger brother Gaius took up the cause. He spoke with fire, calling for grain subsidies and citizenship for Italy's allies. His reforms, too, met the Senate's fury. Cornered and condemned, Gaius took his own life on the Aventine Hill. The people mourned, but the Senate learned a dangerous lesson. Violence could silence reform. Historians still argue whether the Gracchi were idealists or opportunists, whether they truly sought justice or simply power by other means. But what's clear is that their deaths marked a turning point. The Republic had shown it could no longer solve its problems through debate alone. The dagger had entered politics, and it would not leave. Meanwhile, Rome's conquests continued. Spain, Greece, and Asia Minor fell under its control, and with them came waves of art, philosophy, and luxury. Roman homes began to fill with Greek statues, Roman minds with Greek ideas. Senators quoted Plato at dinner parties. Generals collected not just gold, but scrolls and scholars. Ironically, the conquerors became culturally conquered. Still, not everyone admired this new sophistication. Cato the Elder, the stern moralist, warned that Greek influence would soften Roman virtue. He ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the same refrain: Carthage must be destroyed. Even after Carthage was gone, he seemed haunted by the thought that foreign softness could do what no enemy army could undo, Rome from within. And perhaps, in his own way, he was right. The city was bursting at its seams. Its population soared past 1 million, the first in history to do so. Water from aqueducts flowed freely, yet the slums stank. Sewers overflowed, fires spread easily, and disease travelled faster than gossip. Yet amid this chaos, marble monuments kept rising, each one a senator's bid for immortality. In the evenings, the city glowed with lamplight. Musicians played in courtyards, lovers strolled beneath the porticos, and storytellers spoke of Romulus, Aeneas, and the founding myths' tales that felt both distant and eerily relevant. Because in those stories, too, ambition and pride had always walked beside Rome. Somewhere in the forum, an old veteran might have looked up at the statues and wondered if this was still the Republic he fought for, or if it had already begun its slow transformation into something else, something grander, more powerful, but far less free. Rome was ripe for a man like Julius Caesar. The Republic had grown rich and restless, full of ambition, resentment, and opportunity. The Senate bickered endlessly. Generals fought for fame, and the people waited for someone bold enough to promise them glory again. Caesar was that man. He came from an old patrician family, but not a particularly wealthy one. His lineage traced back, he claimed, to Venus herself, a divine touch that flattered both himself and Rome's mythic pride. Yet it wasn't noble blood that carried him upward. It was his brilliance. He spoke with fire, thought like a strategist, and remembered every name and favour ever owed to him. As a young man, he'd already tested fate. Captured once by pirates in the Aegean Sea, he reportedly laughed at his captor's ransom demand, saying they had valued him too cheaply. When freed, he returned with ships, hunted them down, and had them crucified, but mercifully ordered their throats cut first. It was an early glimpse of Caesar's signature blend of charm, cruelty, and efficiency. In Rome, politics was war by other means, and Caesar played it like a general. He rose through the ranks of the cursus honorum, the ladder of public offices, aided by debts so enormous they would have crushed another man. But Caesar had powerful friends. The wealthiest of them, Marcus Licinius Crassus, bankrolled him. Crassus was known as the richest man in Rome, the one who famously bought entire neighbourhoods and then sold them back after his fire brigades saved them. To balance that alliance, Caesar befriended Gnaeus Pompeius, Magnus Pompey, the great Rome's most celebrated general. Together, the three formed an informal power pact, known later as the First Triumvirate. Each offered something: Pompey's legions, Crassus's money, and Caesar's political genius. It was an uneasy alliance, but it would change the Republic forever. Caesar secured the governorship of Gaul, modern-day France, and parts of Belgium and Germany. What followed was a campaign so brutal and brilliant, it turned him from politician to living legend. Over 8 years, his armies conquered tribe after tribe, crossing rivers and mountains no Roman army had dared before. He wrote dispatches back to Rome, the Gallic Wars, a masterpiece of propaganda written in the third person, as if history itself were narrating his triumphs. A quirky but true detail: Caesar's troops adored him because he fought alongside them, sharing their rations and dangers. He addressed them not as soldiers, but as comrades. When morale dipped, he'd joke or share stories, earning a loyalty no Senate decree could command. Once, during a campaign, his men faced a fierce storm at sea. While others panicked, Caesar reportedly said, calmly, "You carry Caesar and his fortune." And somehow they survived. But while Caesar conquered abroad, his enemies multiplied at home. The Senate grew uneasy, fearing that his victories, wealth, and army would make him too powerful. Pompey, once his ally, turned rival. Crassus was killed in a disastrous campaign in Parthia, and the balance of power collapsed. Rome trembled once again at the edge of civil war. In 49 BCE, the Senate, pushed by Pompey, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. They expected submission. Instead, Caesar chose defiance. At the border of Italy, the Rubicon River marked the line no general could cross with an army. Standing before its waters, Caesar hesitated briefly, then made his choice. "The die is cast," he said, "alia iacta est," and led his legions across. Historians still argue whether that moment marked ambition or necessity, whether Caesar sought power for himself or simply feared being destroyed by his rivals. Whatever the truth, his crossing began Rome's most famous civil war. Pompey fled to Greece. The Senate followed him. Caesar marched swiftly through Italy, encountering little resistance. His forces captured Rome without bloodshed, then pursued Pompey across the Adriatic. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar's smaller army crushed Pompey's larger one through sheer tactical genius. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. Instead, the pharaoh, hoping to please Caesar, had Pompey murdered and presented his severed head as a gift. Caesar was said to weep when he saw it. Egypt, however, offered Caesar more than grief. There he met Cleopatra, the young queen, whose charm and intelligence would capture both his heart and his political imagination. The two became allies and lovers, sailing the Nile together in a display of opulence that stunned even Roman chroniclers. Cleopatra bore him a son, Caesarion, a child who would become both a symbol of unity and a threat to Caesar's enemies. Returning to Rome, Caesar was unstoppable. He was declared dictator first temporarily, then for life. He launched sweeping reforms, reducing debt, expanding the Senate, reorganizing the calendar into the Julian system that, with minor adjustments, we still use today. He planned massive building projects, new colonies, and a codified legal order. To many Romans, he seemed the answer to chaos. To others, he was the end of liberty. The Senate's whispers grew sharper. Some senators feared that the Republic, already fragile, was about to die. A group of conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, began to meet in secret. They told themselves they were saving Rome. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate unarmed. As he took his seat, the conspirators surrounded him. Blades flashed. He fought back at first, but when he saw Brutus, the man he trusted like a son among them, he stopped. Et tu, Brute, he said quietly, or so legend tells us. Then he fell, at the base of Pompey's statue, the final irony of his life. Rome fell silent. The man who had conquered Gaul, rewritten laws, and dared to reshape the Republic, lay dead, not in battle, but in the heart of the government he tried to command. Yet even in death he would not fade. His funeral would ignite the next and bloodiest chapter of Rome's history. The marble floor of the Senate was still stained when Rome began to unravel. Julius Caesar's death, meant to save the Republic, did the opposite. The conspirators imagined that by striking one man, they would restore freedom. But Rome had outgrown the old balance of laws and debates. It had tasted the efficiency of command, and there was no going back. In the days following the assassination, chaos gripped the city. Some citizens cheered the so-called liberators, believing they had slain a tyrant. Others mourned Caesar as a hero who had brought peace and prosperity. His body lay in the Forum, draped in white and marked by 23 stab wounds, though, ironically, most historians believe only one had been fatal. The people gathered, waiting to see how Rome would explain itself. It was at Caesar's funeral that history took a decisive turn. His friend and ally, Mark Antony, stood before the crowd. Calm at first, he spoke of Caesar's generosity of his reforms, his victories, his refusal to become king. Then, lifting the bloodied toga for all to see, he turned their grief into fury. The crowd erupted, storming through the city, burning the houses of the assassins. In that fiery night, the dream of a peaceful republic was consumed. The conspirators fled, scattering across the provinces. Rome needed order again, and Antony seemed ready to provide it. But in Caesar's will lay a surprise, the adoption of a grandnephew named Gaius Octavius, known to history as Octavian. Barely 19, frail and soft-spoken, he appeared no threat to seasoned generals. Yet beneath the modest exterior was a mind as sharp as Caesar's blade. Octavian claimed his inheritance boldly. Declaring himself Caesar's rightful heir, he rallied the legions who had served his great uncle. Many of them, loyal to the name more than the man, joined him without hesitation. Rome now had two centres of power: Antony, the veteran commander with charisma and soldiers, and Octavian, the legal heir with youth and destiny. Historians still argue whether Octavian genuinely sought justice, or merely recognized that revenge was the surest path to authority. Either way, he aligned briefly with Antony and another general, Lepidus, forming the second triumvirate. Their alliance, unlike the first, was official and ruthless. They divided the Roman world among themselves and began a campaign of purges. Lists of enemies were posted in the forum. Anyone named could be killed on sight. Property was seized, rivals executed, debts cancelled. Even Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and defender of republican ideals, fell victim. His eloquent words against tyranny had no protection now. Antony's soldiers hunted him down, and his severed head was displayed in the forum, a grim warning that speech had lost its power in Rome. With their enemies dead, the triumvirs turned outward. The conspirators who had killed Caesar gathered their own armies in Greece. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. Antony and Octavian's forces clashed with those of Brutus and Cassius across the plains of Macedonia. When the dust settled, the assassins lay dead, one by suicide, the other by despair. The Republic had no defenders left. Rome's liberty had died on its own sword. In the years that followed, Antony and Octavian shared an uneasy peace. Lepidus faded into irrelevance, leaving two masters of the Roman world. Antony took the eastern provinces, where he soon encountered and fell in love with Cleopatra of Egypt, Caesar's former lover and the last pharaoh. Together, they ruled as though the Mediterranean were their private empire. Cleopatra gave him children, and the two lived in glittering luxury along the Nile. To Romans, this romance seemed like betrayal. They whispered that Antony had traded his toga for silk, his Latin for Egyptian, and his loyalty for love. Octavian saw his opening. In Rome, he waged a propaganda war. Coins appeared, showing Cleopatra as a foreign seductress, Antony as her puppet. Pamphlets described them planning to move the capital to Alexandria. The Senate, swayed by fear and rhetoric, declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. In 31 BCE, their fleets met off the coast of Greece at the Battle of Actium. The sea boiled with ships, fire, and smoke. Antony's larger force began to falter under Octavian's tighter discipline. When Cleopatra's ships suddenly turned and fled, Antony followed, abandoning his navy in confusion and heartbreak. Historians still argue whether her flight was panic, strategy, or betrayal. Either way, the battle was lost. The lovers retreated to Egypt, where defeat closed in. As Octavian's armies entered Alexandria, Antony fell on his sword, dying in Cleopatra's arms. She, refusing to be paraded through Rome as a trophy, ended her life soon after, supposedly by the bite of an asp. Whether true or not, the image was powerful. Egypt's queen choosing death over humiliation. With their deaths, Octavian stood alone. The civil wars that had consumed Rome for a century were finally over, but peace came at a price. The Republic had become ungovernable, its assemblies, laws, and traditions exhausted. The people no longer wanted debate, they wanted stability. Octavian offered it. In 27 BCE, he performed a masterstroke of political theatre. Standing before the Senate, he claimed to restore all power to them, pretending to step back. In return, they named him Augustus, the revered one. It was a new title for a new kind of ruler. Not a king, not quite a dictator, but something divine and permanent. The Republic, technically, still existed. The Senate still met, the assemblies still voted, but everyone knew the truth. Rome now had an emperor. Augustus wrapped absolute power in republican forms like silk around a sword, and the people welcomed it. After generations of chaos, they were simply too tired to resist. Some whispered that Julius Caesar's ghost had finally won. As the torches burned that night on the Palatine Hill, Augustus looked out over a city transformed. The Republic's marble floors had been washed clean, but its spirit lingered only in memory. Rome had traded freedom for peace, argument for order, and would never be the same again. When the dust of Rome's civil wars finally settled, the city was weary but alive. Streets once echoing with riots now hummed with rebuilding. The veterans who had fought on every side longed for rest, and merchants, weary of uncertainty, longed for stability. Out of the smoke and exhaustion, one man stood at the centre of it all, Gaius Octavius, now called Caesar Augustus. Augustus was not a conqueror in the old sense. He didn't roar on battlefields like Alexander or hurl speeches like Caesar. His genius was subtler, political, patient, precise. He understood that after decades of chaos, people didn't want another ruler waving a sword. They wanted the illusion of normalcy, the feeling that Rome was still the republic it had always been. So Augustus gave them exactly that, a republic in name and an empire in truth. He presented himself not as king or dictator, but as princeps, first among equals. The Senate still met, the consuls still changed yearly, the assemblies still voted, but behind it all, every real decision flowed through him. His power rested quietly in 3 hands: control of the armies, the treasury, and the provinces. It was an arrangement so graceful that even the senators who knew they'd been outmaneuvered found it hard to resist. Historians still debate whether Augustus truly believed in his own illusion, whether he saw himself as a servant of Rome or its master cloaked in modesty. What's certain is that his rule transformed the Mediterranean world. He began by healing the city itself. Temples were rebuilt, aqueducts restored, and streets paved with marble. He famously said he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Statues of the gods were repaired, old festivals revived, and morality laws enforced. Augustus wanted not just to rule Rome, but to reform its soul. He encouraged family life, punished adultery, and exalted the virtues of simplicity and loyalty. The irony, of course, was that his own household was anything but tranquil. His wife, Livia Drusilla, became one of the most influential women in Roman history, graceful, intelligent, and politically shrewd. She stood beside him as the perfect Roman matron, though rumours whispered that her calm smile hid a talent for eliminating rivals. Whether true or not, she became the model of imperial decorum, the empress, before the title existed. Augustus's personal life was filled with both triumph and heartbreak. His only biological child, Julia, was beautiful and brilliant but rebellious. She mocked her father's moral reforms by living a life of scandal that would one day force him to exile her. Historians still chuckle at the irony. The emperor who tried to legislate morality couldn't control his own daughter, but his public life thrived. Augustus cleverly reorganized the provinces, keeping the peaceful ones under Senate control while the volatile borderlands remained under his. That meant, of course, that he commanded the legions stationed along those borders and therefore all real military power. His grip on the empire was quiet but absolute. To the citizens, peace, the Pax Romana, felt like sunlight after a storm. Roads stretched across continents, bringing goods, news, and ideas faster than ever before. Merchants from Spain, Egypt, and Judea traded under the same Roman law. The Mediterranean became what poets called Mare Nostrum, our sea. For the first time in history, an entire world felt united by roads and order rather than fear. Yet Augustus understood that peace alone would not sustain loyalty. Symbols would. He filled the city with monuments celebrating victory, most famously the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, carved with scenes of family, prosperity, and divine favour. Even religion itself became political art. Augustus encouraged the worship of his adoptive father, Julius Caesar, as a god subtly turning himself into the son of a god. It was brilliant branding, long before emperors would claim divinity outright. One quirky fact: Augustus was deeply superstitious. He wore a small piece of seal skin under his clothes for protection against lightning, a superstition that became famous enough to be noted by later biographers. Despite his calm composure, he believed fortune and the gods had guided him and might just as easily turn against him. He kept his rule efficient through loyal allies. Marcus Agrippa, his lifelong friend and military genius, built harbours, aqueducts, and even the original Pantheon. It was Agrippa who commanded the decisive naval victory at Actium, and Agrippa who ensured Rome's armies stayed loyal not to generals, but to Augustus himself. Still, the emperor never forgot that his position rested on delicate foundations. He surrounded himself with guards, limited his exposure, and balanced power carefully among potential rivals. In public, he remained modest. He refused extravagant titles and dined simply, though his simple dinners often featured delicacies imported from every corner of the empire. As the years passed, Augustus began to shape the future beyond himself. He adopted a series of heirs, first his nephew Marcellus, then his friend Agrippa, and finally his stepsons Tiberius and Drusus. Fate, however, seemed to toy with him. One by one, his chosen successors died young. "Would that I had never married or had children," he once lamented. Toward the end of his reign, Rome hardly remembered what the Republic had been. A whole generation had grown up under peace and order, unaware that their princeps was, in truth, an emperor. The Senate still met, but its debates were theatre. The real empire stretched from the cold moors of Britain to the sands of Egypt, all under one man's quiet command. When Augustus finally died in 14 CE, at the age of 75, he was said to have uttered to his attendants, "Have I played my part well? Then applaud as I exit." The stage metaphor was fitting. His life had been the greatest performance in Roman history, the seamless transformation of a republic into an empire, achieved not by conquest, but by calm control. The Senate declared him a god, and temples rose in his name. Citizens lit candles before his statue and whispered prayers to divine Augustus, as if Rome itself had become eternal under his shadow. Yet beneath the marble calm, the machinery of empire was already in motion, powerful, glittering, and, like all great engines, bound one day to crack. The age that followed Augustus was an age of confidence, calm, orderly, and luminous. Rome, now undisputed master of the known world, entered what historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For nearly 2 centuries, the Mediterranean basked in an unprecedented stability. The legions stood guard at distant frontiers, merchants moved freely, and the empire's roads carried everything from olive oil to gossip. From the cold mists of Britannia to the deserts of Arabia, milestones marked the passage of empire. Roman roads were marvels of engineering straight, as if drawn by divine hands, paved with stone and built to last millennia. "All roads lead to Rome" was more than a saying, it was a truth. Couriers could carry a message from the Rhine to the Nile faster than any civilization before or after for 1,000 years. Along these arteries flowed trade, ideas, and the quiet hum of daily life. Water, too, became Rome's signature. The aqueducts, immense stone arches striding across valleys, delivered fresh water to cities hundreds of miles away. Public fountains burbled even in poor neighbourhoods, and the famous thermae, or public baths, became centres of life. A citizen could wash, gossip, debate, philosophy, and even close a business deal, all in one afternoon's soak. A quirky fact from this era. Some baths used a mixture of crushed shells and crocodile dung as sunscreen, a strange but apparently effective invention borrowed from Egypt. Under Augustus's successors, Rome reached a kind of serene rhythm. The first emperor after him, Tiberius, ruled with discipline and suspicion, a man who preferred Capri's solitude to Rome's politics. His reign brought efficiency, but also fear, as treason trials became common and whispers dangerous. Then came Caligula, his name meaning little boots, from his childhood, among soldiers who turned divine vanity into theatre. He demanded worship while still alive, once ordering his horse Incitatus to be made a priest, and perhaps even planned to make it consul. Historians still argue whether he was truly mad or simply intoxicated by absolute power. His assassination returned the empire to uneasy sanity, and the Senate reluctantly crowned Claudius, the stammering, scholarly uncle whom everyone had underestimated. Claudius, mocked for his limp and intellect, proved an unexpectedly capable ruler. He expanded the empire into Britain, bringing its tin and distant tribes into Rome's embrace. He also oversaw major administrative reforms and vast construction projects, including new aqueducts that still stand today. Ironically, this quiet, bookish emperor would die under suspicious circumstances, poisoned, it said, by his ambitious wife Agrippina to secure the throne for her son Nero. And Nero, oh Nero. His reign was the empire's first great spectacle of excess. He fancied himself an artist and actor, performing songs in theatres where no one dared leave until he finished. When a great fire consumed much of Rome in 64 CE, rumours spread that Nero had played the lyre while the city burned. Whether true or not, he certainly rebuilt it to his taste, erecting the lavish Domus Aurea, the Golden House, with its rotating dining room and walls glittering in gold leaf. Historians still debate whether the fire was accident, conspiracy, or divine punishment. But Nero's extravagance and paranoia eventually consumed him. Accused of murdering his own mother and countless rivals, he fled the city as rebellion rose against him. "What an artist dies in me," he reportedly cried before taking his own life. With his death in 68 CE, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended, and chaos returned briefly. In one frantic year, 4 emperors rose and fell: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, who restored order through sheer competence. Vespasian and his sons would rebuild Rome's dignity. It was under his reign that the Colosseum began to rise, a monumental amphitheatre built not by kings, but by the spoils of war. Ironically, the money came from the sack of Jerusalem, where Roman legions under Vespasian's son Titus crushed a Jewish revolt and destroyed the Second Temple. The Arch of Titus still stands in Rome, carved with soldiers carrying away its sacred treasures. Despite its brutality, this was also an age of engineering triumphs. Roman cities gleamed with marble forums, amphitheatres, and temples. The empire's borders stretched farther than ever, from Scotland's highlands to the sands of the Sahara, from the Rhine to the Euphrates. Yet for all its might, Rome's genius lay in assimilation rather than destruction. Local elites were invited into the system. Roman citizenship became a prize, not a punishment. Latin and Greek coexisted, blending cultures into something both diverse and distinctly Roman. It was also a golden age of learning. Philosophers like Seneca and Epictetus preached Stoicism, the art of inner calm in a turbulent world. Poets such as Virgil, Horace, and Ovid filled libraries with verses that shaped Western imagination for centuries. In one quiet irony, as emperors declared themselves divine, writers whispered timeless doubts about fate, virtue, and mortality. Everywhere, divine imagery adorned public life. Emperors were no longer just men, they were semi-divine figures, their faces on coins, their birthdays celebrated as holy days. Temples rose in their honor. The cult of the emperor became the glue of empire, uniting citizens in worship that was as political as it was spiritual. A farmer in Gaul, a merchant in Syria, and a soldier in North Africa could all bow before the same divine figure, the Emperor of Rome. And yet, beneath the marble calm, there were tremors. Revolts flared at the edges, especially in Judea, where a small sect following a crucified teacher began spreading a strange new faith centered on love, humility, and salvation. It was a whisper in the age of emperors unnoticed, almost irrelevant, and yet, centuries later, it would reshape the very empire that ignored it. For now, though, Rome glittered at its zenith. Markets overflowed with spices from Arabia, silk from China, amber from the Baltic. Roman law governed contracts, marriages, and property with precision. A citizen could walk from one end of the empire to the other under the same flag, speaking Latin or Greek, protected by the same laws. No other civilization before or since has managed such seamless order over so vast a realm. At night, as lamps flickered along the Via Sacra, senators walked beneath the marble arches that bore their ancestors' names. They believed, perhaps sincerely, that Rome's peace would last forever, that its walls would never crumble, its gods never fade. They couldn't yet hear the faint echoes of distant thunder, the first murmurs of change that would one day shake even the eternal city. Rome, the city of marble and ambition, entered an age where grandeur became inseparable from madness. After Nero's death, the empire had tasted instability. Civil wars, shifting loyalties, and legions proclaiming emperors by force. But from this chaos rose a dynasty that sought to define Rome not just through conquest, but through spectacle, a civilization performing its own power before the eyes of gods and men alike. This was the age of fire, madness, and marble. The Flavian emperors, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, turned Rome's scars into monuments. Where Nero's golden house once sprawled in decadent isolation, Vespasian ordered a new symbol to rise, one for the people. It would be vast, open, and awe-inspiring. The Flavian amphitheatre, known to history as the Colosseum, built upon the drained lake of Nero's private palace, the Colosseum was both an act of political genius and divine theatre. Its scale was almost impossible. More than 50,000 spectators could sit in tiered perfection beneath an ingenious system of arches and vaults. The marble facade gleamed white in the sun, and its awnings, massive sails of linen, unfurled to shade the crowds. Inside, the floor hid complex machinery, elevators, trapdoors, and pulleys that could lift cages of lions or entire trees for staged hunts. Some accounts even tell of the arena being flooded for mock naval battles, miniature seas conjured at the emperor's command. But the heart of it all was blood. The Munera gladiatorial games became the empire's grand performance. Men from every corner of Rome's conquests, prisoners, slaves, volunteers seeking glory, trained to fight for honour and survival. They entered the sand to the roar of the crowd, clad in distinct armour. The Retiarius with his net and trident, the Secutor with heavy shield and short sword, the Murmillo with his fish-crested helmet. Death was not always certain, but danger always was. A skilled gladiator could become a celebrity, his likeness painted on walls, his victories whispered in markets. And when a fighter fell, the crowd looked to the emperor. A turned thumb could mean death, a raised hand, mercy. It was the emperor's will made visible, life and death distributed as spectacle. To the Romans, this was not cruelty, but affirmation. A reminder that even in violence, order and hierarchy prevailed. Vespasian's son Titus who completed the Colosseum, became the empire's darling, a ruler of charm and compassion. His short reign was marked by tragedy. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and time. The disaster shocked the empire, freezing Roman life in an eerie tableau that would remain untouched for centuries. You could still see men in their final gestures, wrote Pliny the Younger, describing the horror. Titus also oversaw the final stages of the Jewish war, the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, an event immortalized on the Arch of Titus. To Rome, it was a triumph. To others, a wound that would never heal. Yet despite such brutality, Titus's generosity in rebuilding after disasters won him deep affection. When he died suddenly, Rome wept a rare honour for an emperor. His brother Domitian would not be so loved. Intelligent but cold, he sought divine reverence in his lifetime, demanding to be called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Under him, the empire became efficient yet fearful. Informers thrived. Paranoia ruled. He strengthened the borders, built monumental temples, and sponsored lavish games, but his cruelty alienated both Senate and family. In 96 CE, assassins struck him down in his own palace, ending the Flavian line. Yet in his wake came the emperors of the Golden Age, the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. These men, chosen for merit rather than blood, presided over a century of relative peace, prosperity, and artful governance. Under Trajan, Rome reached its maximum territorial extent, conquering Dacia, modern Romania, Arabia, and Armenia. The spoils of Dacia alone were so immense that for a time Romans paid no taxes. Trajan celebrated his victories not with words but in stone. His forum, crowned by Trajan's column, told his story in a spiral of sculpted reliefs, a continuous film carved in marble. The column still stands, showing soldiers bridging rivers, building forts, and facing the Dacians in battle, every scene a testament to imperial precision. Then came Hadrian, the philosopher-emperor, lover of Greek art, and architect of peace. He pulled back Rome's borders, understanding that expansion without control meant ruin. Across the misty north, he ordered a great wall, Hadrian's Wall, to mark the empire's edge in Britannia. The boundary of the world, Roman poets called it. Hadrian's reign was one of beauty and reflection. He built the Pantheon anew its dome, still the largest unreinforced in the world, an engineering miracle of harmony and light. Its oculus, a perfect circle open directly to the heavens, symbolizing the unity between gods and empire. Within his villa at Tivoli, he recreated the entire world in miniature Greek theatres, Egyptian temples, shimmering pools, a paradise of memory and art. Yet his soul was marked by melancholy. The death of Antinous, his beloved companion, broke him. In grief, Hadrian declared the youth a god, founding the cult of Antinous across the empire. Temples, coins, and statues bore his image, the final echo of pagan beauty before Christianity would change everything. Under Antoninus Pius, the empire flourished quietly. His reign was one of laws and construction, of peace without glory, the kind of rule historians rarely celebrate, but nations always need. Then came Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. From the frontiers of Germania, he wrote his Meditations, reflections on virtue and mortality that still guide minds 2 millennia later. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. Yet even wisdom could not protect Rome from fate. During Marcus's reign, plague ravaged the empire, carried by soldiers returning from the east. His son Commodus, vain, brutal, and deluded, undid much of what his father had built. He fancied himself a living Hercules, striding into the Colosseum to slay beasts before cheering crowds. The son of a philosopher became a parody of power, proof that Rome's golden harmony could not last forever. The Colosseum, the marble temples, the baths and libraries all glittered brighter than ever, even as the moral foundation beneath them began to crack. The empire had mastered the art of spectacle, but not the art of restraint. Beauty and brutality had become inseparable, an empire of wonders built upon suffering, of peace sustained by fear. At night, the amphitheatre still echoed with roars of lions, of men, of crowds hungry for distraction. The emperor's thumb still decided fates under torchlight, and outside, in quiet homes, small gatherings whispered of a different kingdom, one without blood or crowns. The fire had not gone out, it had merely changed its flame. The empire that once seemed eternal now trembled beneath its own weight. From the misty edges of Britannia to the sands of Arabia, Rome's borders stretched wider than any in human history. But with every mile of conquest came another mile to defend. What had once been a well-oiled machine of legions, governors, and taxes began to groan under the strain. After the death of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the empire entered a new age, one not of glory, but of exhaustion. His son Commodus ruled like a spoiled godchild, turning the empire into his stage. He renamed Rome the colony of Commodus and declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules, complete with lion skin and club. He even fought in the Colosseum, striking down tethered animals for applause. The Senate watched in horror as the air of stoicism became a caricature of tyranny. When conspirators finally strangled him in 192 CE, Rome sighed in relief, but that breath of relief turned to chaos. Without a clear successor, the empire fell into what historians call the Year of the Five Emperors. One general after another claimed the throne, propped up by whichever army shouted loudest. The Senate's authority meant nothing now. Real power lay in the hands of legions scattered across provinces. A telling moment came when the Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers meant to protect the emperor, simply auctioned off the throne to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, bought it like a prize at market. He ruled barely 2 months before being executed. It was the perfect symbol of Rome's decay. Emperors bought like property, loyalty sold like wine. Eventually, Septimius Severus, a hardened general from North Africa, seized control. He strengthened the army, raised soldiers' pay, and declared, "Enrich the troops and ignore everyone else." The advice worked for a while. His dynasty expanded the borders and filled the treasury with war spoils. But Severus also militarized Rome's politics beyond repair. The emperor's sword became the law. Senators were ornaments at best, hostages at worst. His son Caracalla inherited this new military monarchy and his father's ruthlessness. In a single decree, he granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire. Some historians praise this as an act of equality. Others see it as a tax scheme, since citizens paid more revenue to the state. Either way, it blurred the line between conqueror and conquered. The whole Mediterranean now shared one name, Romanus. But Caracalla's temper was legend. He murdered his own brother Geta in their mother's arms, then outlawed the brother's memory. Even his statues were defaced. His rule ended the same way it began, with blood. A soldier struck him down on campaign in the east. After his death, chaos returned. Emperors rose and fell so quickly that historians can barely list them without running out of ink. Between 235 and 284 CE, just 50 years, Rome saw more than 20 emperors, many reigning only months. The empire splintered into pieces. In the west, a Gallic empire formed with its own rulers. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire, under the remarkable Queen Zenobia, challenged Roman power outright. Zenobia's tale is one of history's hidden gems. The Queen of Palmyra, a city of desert splendor and trade wealth, she spoke several languages, read Greek philosophy, and commanded armies with confidence. She claimed descent from Cleopatra and dreamed of restoring Eastern glory. For a moment, she succeeded conquering Egypt, Syria, and much of Asia Minor. Rome's eagles wavered. But Emperor Aurelian, one of the era's few stabilizing figures, marched east, defeated her, and paraded her in golden chains through Rome. Yet even he admired her courage. Still, Aurelian's victory came at a cost. The empire was exhausted, its treasury empty, its frontiers bleeding, Germanic tribes pushed across the Rhine, Persians attacked from the east. Trade routes faltered, and the once stable silver denarius coin became almost worthless. Inflation soared. A loaf of bread that once cost a few coins could soon cost thousands. And through it all, the Roman people clung to the rituals of grandeur. The baths still steamed, the circuses still roared, and senators still wore togas, but beneath the marble, panic whispered. The gods, it seemed, were no longer listening. Then came Diocletian, a soldier of humble birth. He rose through discipline and ruthlessness to seize power in 284 CE. What he found was not an empire, but a patchwork of ruins held together by habit. Diocletian, ever the pragmatist, decided that one man could no longer rule such vastness. So he divided power, creating the tetrarchy, or rule of four. Two senior emperors, Augusti, and two juniors, Caesares, would govern different regions, ensuring stability. It was a bold experiment, half empire, half bureaucracy, and for a time it worked. Diocletian reformed the tax system, froze prices, though not very successfully, and restructured the army. He even launched the last great persecution of Christians, seeing their faith as a threat to unity. Ironically, this attempt to crush Christianity only made it stronger. Martyrdom has a way of drawing attention. Diocletian's reforms held back the tide for a generation. But when he retired, the only Roman emperor ever to do so voluntarily, his system unravelled. His co-emperors and their heirs fought over succession, plunging the empire once again into civil war. Historians still argue whether Diocletian saved Rome or merely delayed its inevitable fall. Some see him as the last true restorer, others as the architect of a rigid state that choked its own spirit. What's clear is that the Republic's old ideals were long gone. What remained was a massive, militarized machine, efficient, impressive, but increasingly brittle. In the far corners of the empire, barbarians were stirring not yet the destroyers of legend, but restless neighbours watching Rome's weakness with keen eyes. The legions that once thundered across continents now defended crumbling walls. And still, Rome endured proud, weary, unbent. The marble gleamed, the roads stretched straight and proud, and travellers still whispered in awe at the sheer scale of it all. Yet beneath the surface, the empire's heartbeat faltered. Strength had become strain. The world was shifting, and Rome, though vast, could not stand still forever. The empire had once conquered the world, now it struggled not to consume itself. What began as murmurs of unrest had swelled into a storm that touched every province, every field, every coin. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, but to those who lived it, it must have felt like the end of days. Rome's strength had always been order, the disciplined rhythm of its armies, the flow of trade across its roads, the balance of emperor and Senate. But now that order cracked like old marble. Civil wars erupted so frequently that the people stopped learning emperors' names. Soldiers swore allegiance to whoever promised higher pay or vengeance for the last betrayal. Provinces that once bowed to Rome began declaring independence as if the imperial dream were dissolving into dust. At one point, there were 3 empires instead of one: the Central Roman Empire, the Gallic Empire in the west, and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. What had been united under Augustus now split into shards, each reflecting Rome's glory, each fighting to claim its inheritance. Armies marched not against barbarians, but against fellow Romans. The legions of Gaul faced those of Italy. Egypt's grain fleets were blockaded by Roman ships. The once solid spine of the empire twisted into a serpent devouring itself. And as if the gods themselves were displeased, disaster came in waves. Famine struck first, as war and neglect ruined harvests. Then came the plague, carried along the trade routes that had once been Rome's lifeblood. Disease swept through cities and camps. Historians now call it the Plague of Cyprian, after the Christian bishop who described it in grim detail. Fevers, bleeding, limbs decaying while victims still breathed. In some regions, entire villages vanished. It wasn't the first great epidemic Rome had faced. The Antonine Plague a century earlier, likely smallpox, had already killed millions, but this one seemed crueler, hitting an empire already weakened. Temples overflowed with offerings. Priests begged the old gods for mercy, but it was the Christians, quietly tending to the sick regardless of faith, who won admiration. Their courage during the plague planted seeds that would later change Rome itself. The economy collapsed alongside the population. With fewer taxpayers, fewer soldiers, and endless wars, emperors resorted to desperate measures. Coins were debased, silver replaced with tin and bronze, until their value melted like wax in the sun. Prices soared. A loaf of bread could cost what a soldier earned in months. Some cities reverted to barter. Trade slowed to a crawl, and bandits ruled the roads, once guarded by legions. In response, emperors began ruling more like warlords than statesmen. They wore armour in public, surrounded by soldiers rather than senators. The title imperator, once meaning victorious general, now meant survival. One of the few who truly brought order out of this darkness was Aurelian. A man of iron will, he fought and defeated both the Gallic and Palmyrene breakaway empires, reuniting Rome in the 272nd CE. He was called Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. Under him, the empire briefly breathed again. He built the Aurelian walls, around the city vast fortifications that still stand today, a symbol of how even mighty Rome no longer felt safe without defences. But Aurelian's reign ended like so many before, with assassination. His death plunged the empire back into turmoil. It seemed every emperor was either murdered or proclaimed by the army in rebellion. In one 50-year span, nearly every ruler died violently. Stability became the rarest luxury in the known world. And yet somehow Rome did not die. Its roads still led to the eternal city. Its language still echoed in courts and markets. Its laws still bound people from Britain to Syria. Even in decay, Rome remained too big to vanish. Like an ancient oak struck by lightning, it burned and smouldered but refused to fall. The crisis also changed its people. The Romans who survived those grim decades were no longer the confident citizens of Augustus's day. They were pragmatic, hardened, almost fatalistic. They trusted less in the Senate or the gods, and more in whoever could keep the grain flowing and the borders secure. Power had shifted from marble halls to military camps. A quirky footnote survives from this time. One emperor, Elagabalus, barely a teenager, tried to make his Syrian sun god the chief deity of Rome. He built a temple to the god Elagabal, married a Vestal virgin, and replaced Jupiter's statue with a black meteorite said to have fallen from heaven. The Romans were scandalized. He was murdered by his own guards within 4 years, and his body was thrown into the Tiber. Yet his story shows how fractured, desperate, and culturally fluid the empire had become. Historians still argue whether this age of crisis was truly a single catastrophe or a slow transformation, a period where Rome shed its old skin to survive in a new world. Perhaps both are true. What's certain is that the empire that emerged from the 3rd century was profoundly changed. The Republic's echoes were gone. Even the illusion of shared power had faded. When Diocletian finally rose to the throne at the century's end, he inherited not a classical empire of marble, but a military state of iron. He saw clearly that Rome could no longer pretend to be what it was. His reforms, the division of the empire, the new bureaucracy, the rigid control of economy and worship, were not just measures of control. They were an admission that the old Rome was dead, and something colder and more centralized had taken its place. And still, amidst ruin, there were signs of endurance. Cities rebuilt, farms returned to life, and trade flickered back to the harbours. The Roman genius for adaptation, for turning defeat into structure, kept working quietly. Even as emperors fell like leaves, the machinery of empire kept moving, creaking, but alive. If the earlier centuries had been Rome's triumphs, this was its trial, a time when the question was no longer, how far can we go, but how long can we last? The eternal city still stood, its temples scarred, its people weary. But the story of Rome was not yet finished. It would survive not through conquest this time, but through transformation. The world had changed, and Rome was changing with it. Out of the long night of civil wars and plagues, a new kind of ruler stepped forward, one who understood that power no longer came only from legions or gold, but from belief. His name was Constantine, and under his reign the empire would be reborn not in the Forum, but beneath the sign of the cross. When Constantine was born around 272 CE, the empire was already split into 4 parts under Diocletian's tetrarchy. His father, Constantius Chlorus, ruled in the west, while other emperors governed the east and central provinces. The system had worked briefly until ambition, as always, tore it apart. When Diocletian retired, the balance collapsed, and once again generals turned against one another. Constantine grew up amid this storm. He was no ordinary prince, tall, commanding, sharp-eyed, and unlike many soldiers of his age, he could read, write, and think in strategy as easily as in swordplay. When his father died in Britain in 306 CE, the legions there proclaimed Constantine emperor. The problem? There were already several emperors. Civil war followed, as it always did in Rome. Rival claimants fought across Europe, each minting coins with their own faces, each calling themselves Augustus. For 6 long years, the empire fractured once more, until only 2 men remained, Maxentius in Rome and Constantine in the north. Their final confrontation came beside the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, a crossing over the Tiber, just outside the Eternal City. The night before battle, Constantine reportedly saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light above the sun, with the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, you will conquer. He ordered his soldiers to paint the symbol, the Chi, the first 2 letters of Christ's name, on their shields. When dawn came, Constantine's army charged. Maxentius's forces were driven into the river, his body swept away beneath the bridge. The battle was over, but the empire had changed forever. Constantine entered Rome not as a pagan conqueror, but as a ruler guided by a new faith. Whether the vision was divine or political genius remains debated to this day. Historians still argue whether Constantine's conversion was heartfelt or strategic, whether he embraced Christianity out of conviction, or because it offered the unity his divided empire so desperately needed. But whatever his motives, the consequences were seismic. In 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians full freedom to worship, ending centuries of persecution. The once hunted faith now stood beside imperial power. Churches rose where temples once stood. Bishops began advising emperors. Crosses appeared on standards that had once borne eagles. For the Christians of Rome, it was a miracle. For the pagans, it was an earthquake. Constantine, however, was not content to rule from the old capital. Rome, though still magnificent, was heavy with history, a relic of senatorial privilege, old gods, and decaying politics. The empire's energy had shifted eastward, where trade flowed and borders demanded vigilance. So Constantine chose a new heart for his empire, Byzantium, a small Greek city on the Bosporus, perfectly placed between Europe and Asia. He rebuilt it on a scale worthy of legend broad avenues, gleaming forums, baths, and palaces. In 330 CE, he dedicated it as Nova Roma, New Rome, though everyone soon called it Constantinople. The city was crowned with a golden statue of the emperor himself, holding a globe and wearing a radiant crown of 7 rays like Apollo reborn. Here, east and west blended. Temples to the old gods stood beside basilicas of the new faith. Latin echoed through the streets, but so did Greek. From this city, Constantine ruled a world transformed, a Christian empire draped in imperial grandeur. And yet, he was a man of contradictions. Constantine never fully abandoned pagan symbols. He kept the title Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the Roman religion, and coins still bore the image of Sol Invictus, the unconquered Sunday. Perhaps he saw no conflict between Christ and the Sun, both, after all, sources of light and victory. But his most lasting legacy was unity not of faith alone, but of doctrine. In 325 CE, he summoned bishops from across the empire to Nicaea, a small city in Asia Minor. There, under imperial guidance, the First Ecumenical Council debated the nature of Christ and God, producing the Nicene Creed, a statement of belief that still echoes in churches today. For the first time, theology had become a matter of imperial policy. Constantine's reign wasn't without ruthlessness. He executed his son Crispus and his wife Fausta under mysterious circumstances, possibly born of jealousy or political intrigue. Even in this new Christian empire, blood still flowed in the name of order. But he also endowed charities, built hospitals, and transformed the empire's moral landscape. The army, too, evolved. Constantine introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, so perfectly balanced that it became the backbone of European trade for centuries. His reforms strengthened the frontiers and stabilized the economy, buying the empire another 100 years of strength. And as for the city of Rome itself, it remained majestic, but somehow quieter, like an aging queen watching her crown being passed to a younger rival. The Senate still met, the Colosseum still roared, but the pulse of empire now beat to the east. By the time Constantine died in 337 CE, baptized on his deathbed, the empire was unrecognizable from the one of Augustus or Caesar. Paganism still lingered, but Christianity was now entwined with power. Cross and crown had become one. His successors would inherit a divided world, one foot in marble tradition, the other in spiritual revelation. And though Constantine may not have foreseen it, his decision to shift the empire's heart eastward would ensure that, long after Rome itself crumbled, the empire would endure reborn as Byzantium, guardian of ancient light. In the soft glow of dawn, perhaps the emperor's vision still shimmered across in the sky, guiding a weary world towards something new. The Western Roman Empire did not fall in a single day, nor with a single blow. Its decline stretched over centuries, a slow erosion rather than an earthquake. By the 5th century CE, the legions that had once thundered across Europe were fewer, poorer, and less loyal. The treasury, strained by constant defence and corruption, could no longer pay them in full. Borders that had once been impermeable became porous, letting in tribes that Rome had once subdued with ease. Among these groups were the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, and the Franks. Each carried the memory of Roman civilization with them. They admired its cities, laws, and wealth, yet each also sought to carve their own kingdoms from its decay. The Visigoths, under Alaric, had once served Rome as allies and soldiers, but resentment over mistreatment and unpaid wages led them to march on Italy itself. In 410 CE, they entered Rome and sacked it the first time the city had fallen to a foreign enemy in over 800 years. Citizens reportedly mourned in disbelief. Many scholars still debate whether the shock was more psychological than strategic, for Rome had already lost much of its political and economic influence. The Vandals, crossing from Spain into North Africa, seized Carthage and the grain supply that fed Rome. Legend has it they carried spoils in ships and destroyed temples, though some historians argue the accounts exaggerate their cruelty. Either way, their control of the Mediterranean disrupted commerce and left the empire increasingly isolated. Meanwhile, the Western emperors themselves became shadows of power. Figures like Romulus Augustulus, often called the last emperor, ruled little more than the city of Ravenna. By 476 CE, Odoacer, a Germanic general in Roman service, deposed him, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople. That act is traditionally marked as the fall of the Western Empire, though in truth, Rome had been falling in slow, grinding stages for over a century. Economically, the West had already shifted. The rich cities of the Po Valley, southern Gaul, and Hispania still thrived locally, but trade across the empire's old roads had fractured. Inflation, crop failures, and piracy made long-distance commerce unreliable. Citizens turned inward, relying on fortified towns, local grain, and what security their own communities could provide. The once mighty military roads became paths for mercenaries and raiders as much as for Roman officers. Religiously, the empire was transforming too. Christianity, now the official faith, had spread widely, changing not just temples but daily life. Pagan temples fell silent, but their stones were often reused in churches. Festivals were reinterpreted. Gods who had watched over farmers and soldiers were replaced by saints and martyrs. Even as the empire faltered, belief provided continuity. Families told the same stories of miracles, hope, and redemption that would outlast marble walls. Some of the western provinces resisted with remarkable ingenuity. Gaul saw the rise of local rulers, Merovingian chieftains, who maintained Roman law in pockets even as central authority crumbled. In Britain, Roman forts lingered, and roads remained in use long after legions had withdrawn. Yet everywhere, the drift from centralized power was unmistakable. Rome's old strength depended not just on walls, armies, and coins, but on the shared identity of its people. That identity, stretched across oceans, mountains, and centuries, was fracturing. Oddly, the Eastern Empire, what would later be called Byzantium, survived much better. Its cities were wealthier, trade routes more secure, and armies better paid. Constantinople, fortified by walls and moats, became the new heart of Roman civilization. Western emperors were now figureheads, their authority eroded by distance, decay, and the ambition of local generals. Historians still argue whether the West could have survived with stronger administration or if its collapse was inevitable. Meanwhile, Rome itself continued to fascinate. Even after the sack by Alaric and the Vandals, its walls, forums, and monuments drew travellers, merchants, and scholars. The Colosseum still echoed with the memory of gladiatorial games, temples still rose from the Forum, and statues of Augustus and Trajan gazed down on a city that had once ruled the world. The idea of Rome remained powerful even as the empire that created it vanished. And the people adapted. Survivors settled into smaller communities, fortified towns, and rural estates. They kept Roman laws, traditions, and language alive, even as kings from distant forests and deserts took the imperial titles. What had been a centralized empire became a patchwork of successor kingdoms. In Gaul, the Franks laid the groundwork for a future Europe. In Spain, the Visigoths carved a kingdom. In North Africa, the Vandals held sway until Justinian reclaimed it centuries later. By the late 5th century, the Western Empire existed more in memory than reality. Rome itself was no longer a seat of power. It was a symbol, revered and feared, a city whose name still commanded awe, but whose political authority had evaporated. Its people continued to worship, trade, and live, but they did so under the shadow of new rulers, new languages, and new borders. Even as Rome faded, the Eastern Empire would preserve its legacy. Byzantine administrators, scholars, and artists copied Roman laws, maintained military discipline, and kept the Latin and Greek traditions alive. In Constantinople, the flame of Rome burned bright for another 1,000 years, a reminder that while empires fall, their influence can endure far beyond their political life. By 476 CE, the Western Empire had ceased to exist. Vandals, Goths, and ambitious generals had replaced emperors, legions, and marble forums with kingdoms, fortresses, and new loyalties. Yet in every ruined wall, every surviving road, every church built atop a temple, the memory of Rome lingered, a civilization that once ruled the known world, now living on in fragments, in stories, and in the hearts of those who would carry its culture forward. The eternal city would never truly die, but the empire that had made it eternal was gone, and in its absence, Europe would begin the long, slow journey towards something new. Though the Western Empire had crumbled, the story of Rome did not end with Vandals, Goths, and forgotten legions. In the east, a city of stone and water rose to claim the legacy, Constantinople. Its walls, fortified by Diocletian and expanded by Constantine, held strong against invaders for over a millennium. In this city, the Roman flame burned brighter and longer than anyone in the West could have imagined. Byzantium, soon to be called the Byzantine Empire by historians, was Rome in a new dress. Latin gave way to Greek, but Roman law, administration, and culture endured. The emperor remained absolute, a living symbol of unity, and the church intertwined seamlessly with the state. Hagia Sophia, built under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, soared with domes and mosaics that captured both divine light and imperial authority. its architecture still inspires awe today, a concrete testament to Rome's enduring genius. Justinian himself attempted something audacious to reunite the old Roman world. Through war, diplomacy, and sheer determination, he reclaimed North Africa, parts of Italy, and the southern coast of Hispania. His armies, led by generals like Belisarius, brought back lands long thought lost, but reconquest proved expensive and fleeting. While borders shifted, Justinian's greatest legacy may have been law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law, codified centuries of Roman statutes, principles, and wisdom, a foundation that shapes legal systems to this day. Historians still debate whether Justinian's wars or his laws were his more enduring achievement. In daily life, Byzantium was a world simultaneously ancient and evolving. Citizens shopped in markets shaded by colonnades, whispered court intrigue through palace corridors, and watched chariot races spin around the hippodrome. Here, Roman traditions mingled with Christian rituals and Greek intellect. The empire was vibrant, cosmopolitan, and, at times, fragile, constantly balancing the pull of east and west, of old and new. Meanwhile, Rome's shadow spread far beyond the Mediterranean. In Western Europe, kingdoms of former Roman territories maintained elements of Roman governance, infrastructure, and culture. Cities built on Roman roads flourished, basilicas rose from pagan temples, and Latin became the lingua franca of scholars, priests, and lawyers. The concept of citizenship, property rights, and civic duty, all hallmarks of Rome, endured, threading their way into medieval and modern Europe. Even the very idea of empire centralized, bureaucratic, law-bound, owed its DNA to Rome. Religion, too, carried Roman influence. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, became the spiritual backbone of Europe. Bishops wielded authority once reserved for senators. Councils echoed Roman forums. Pilgrims travelled roads laid centuries before. Churches replaced temples, and monasteries preserved Roman learning, while new kingdoms rose from the ashes. In many ways, Rome's values, law, civic organization, and cultural ambition travelled farther and lasted longer than any army ever could. A quirky reminder of Rome's persistence comes from everyday life. In some Italian villages, roads, aqueducts, and even olive groves planted 2,000 years ago still guide farmers' footsteps. Coins minted under Trajan and Hadrian have been discovered in fields alongside medieval artifacts, a tangible bridge between past and present. Historians still debate the degree to which Roman administration influenced medieval Europe, but few deny its enduring imprint. The Byzantine Empire itself would last until 1453, when the Ottoman Turks finally breached Constantinople. Yet even in its fall, Rome's legacy persisted. Scholars fled west, carrying manuscripts, architectural knowledge, and philosophical ideas that would spark the Renaissance. Roman law influenced the developing legal systems of Italy, France, Spain, and beyond. The idea of a unified, literate, and codified civilization endured long after marble had crumbled. Even today, Rome whispers in unexpected ways. Legal codes, architectural styles, languages, political ideas, and urban planning all trace threads back to the eternal city. Capitals may rise and fall, borders may shift, but the Roman ethos, ambitious, disciplined, and expansive, continues to echo. The road networks still influence European highways. Civic ideals still shape governments. Cultural memory still inspires art, literature, and thought. Rome's story, then, is not merely about conquest or collapse. It is about transformation. It is about resilience in the face of chaos, adaptation in the face of change, and influence that outlives even empire. From the streets of Constantinople to the courthouses of Paris and the halls of the Vatican, the shadow of Rome stretches still a reminder that empires may fall, but ideas endure. So tonight, as you picture the marble forums, the glowing mosaics, and the roads that led to the horizon, remember this: Rome never truly ended. It simply changed form, passing quietly from marble to memory, from legionary to lawmaker, from city to idea. Its heart still beats in the architecture of Europe, the structure of its laws, and in the stories we tell whispers of an empire that conquered time itself.